Hey everybody, this is Death by D4, and this is my original monster for Tome of Beasts 2 for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. There's a lot to go over, so be sure to subscribe and let's dive right on in. So for those of you that don't know, back during the beginning of the year, Kobold Press ran a Kickstarter for their next upcoming monster compendium, being Tome of Beasts 2. Much like the first book, this one comes packed with an absolutely massive amount of new monsters for you to add to your Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition games. In fact, I think the final count of this book actually totaled at 400, which is just absolutely absurd. However, what was cool about this Kickstarter was the fact that you could actually submit your very own monster design to them, and if you were lucky enough to get it accepted, it could then end up being added as a part of the book. In the end, I believe over 500 monster designs were actually submitted to them, and only about 50 of them actually made it in. Well, guess what? I was one of the lucky few who actually got their monster designs accepted into their book. So, in celebration of its release, I just wanted to make a fun video where I go over the original design notes that I sent them, and compare them to how it turned out in the final print. After all, this wasn't some kind of art contest. To submit a monster, you had to do all of the work writing out its lore and creating its stat block, and then after editing and playtester feedback, it's very likely that things could have changed between now and when it actually made its round into publication. So let's just see how well that I did. The concept that I had for this creature actually came from a campaign that I was running during the time of the Kickstarter, and it was one that I tied back into the backstory of one of my players. The monster had slain the player's forefather, and they were on a quest to kill it in the name of personal revenge. Beyond that, the only real information that my player had about it at the time was that it was this enormous creature that appeared only in blankets of dense and mysterious mist, where it would then ambush its prey and violently tear it apart before devouring it. Aside from that, it was obviously a grounded creature, as my player was then able to track it for a number of months. However, in a twist of events, the trail eventually led them to a large body of water, where they then had to sail across in a desperate attempt to try and follow it. I named the monster the Kirakari, as I was inspired by the Japanese words for fog and killer, Kiri and Kira. In appearance, I wanted this creature to resemble something akin to a giant centipede, one with a molded carapace resembling that of an old and rotted tree. As such, I treated it much like an ambushed predator native to swampy regions. That way I could then utilize its natural disguise and mist-created capabilities to try and hide itself amidst its surroundings. However, its mist-creating capabilities actually came from a symbiotic relationship that it had with a mold growing on its carapace, a relationship that the Kirakari maintained by hunting down wyverns, and using their poison to feed and grow its mold. In fact, this relationship is so important to them that they will travel these incredible distances just to try and kill a wyvern. And they'll also try and avoid swimming in salt water whenever possible, as that will just quickly kill all the mold on its shell. However, it's worth noting that this is just a theory in quotation marks. At some point in the campaign, I had plans of setting up the party against the local wyvern, where they would then come across a Kirakari on the hunt. It would have been a really big moment for the campaign, especially for the player who was on the lookout for a creature matching its description. So yeah, anyway, that covers basically all of the lore that I came up with concerning the monster. I can't really say how or why I came up with the ideas that I did, but just that I had this visually striking moment imagined in my head for the campaign, and that's how it took form after I started writing it down. For the Kirakari's stats, I set it up as a CR9 monster, as I wanted it to be reasonably stronger than a CR6 wyvern, and Kobold Press advised us not to design monsters higher than CR10, so that's just what I ended up settling on. I referenced the stat block for our Morhaz, and fiddled around with the CR calculator bit till I finally came up with these exact numbers here. Then I gave it a reasonable walking speed and swim speed, as I didn't want to make the creature capable of flying or burrowing, as that would have just undermined its entire mist-creating mechanic altogether. Then I gave it proficiency in perception and expertise in stealth, as both are skills that are absolutely required in order for it to hunt efficiently. Then I gave it immunities to acid and poison damage, as that just made sense, and immunity to the poison condition, again, because that just made sense. Finally, I gave it 20 feet of blind sight and 60 feet of tremor sense. That way the Kirakari would be more than capable of perceiving its prey without being hindered by its own mist. With its abilities, I gave it one called Misty Veil, which would create a field of mist that expanded about 60 feet around the Kirakari, lightly obscuring everything in the area. The mist could be dispersed, but it would just simply reappear on the Kirakari's next turn, as it would be constantly reproducing it. You might think that this doesn't do very much for it, but remember that light obscurity does cause disadvantage on perception checks, and no amount of dark vision is going to be able to help you see through something like mist. That, and considering that this monster has a passive stealth of 21, you're probably more than likely never going to see it while it's hiding. Then I gave it the feature Unseen Attacker, which would allow the Kirakari to use its bonus action to hide, dash, and disengage. Also, it granted it advantage on opportunity attacks made against creatures unable to see it. This would have allowed the Kirakari to then act as a hit-and-run monster, striking out at players nearby them, only to then retreat with a player trapped within its jaws. Oh, speaking of which, let's go over its attacks now. First up, I gave it two different forms of attacks, being a slam and a bite. The slam was weaker than its bite, but I gave it the ability to use the slam twice as a part of its multi-attack, and the bite was capable of grappling and restraining a creature hit by it. Honestly, the image that I came up with in my head was that this giant thing would just lunge out of the mist, grapple someone within its jaws, and then proceed to just slam them in the ground repeatedly. Definitely a very brutal experience that I wouldn't wish on any of my players. You know, despite the fact that I was planning on it. And as for its final ability, I gave the Kirakari Blinding Veil, which was something that it could do as an action on a recharge of 5 or 6. The Kirakari could then expel an enormous puff of dense mist, causing heavy obscurity within everything of 30 feet of it. However, after one turn, the heavy obscurity of the mist would then dissipate. With this, the Kirakari would then have a solid means of keeping its prey in check, utilizing the mist either as a means of landing its bite attack, or as a means of retreat when the battle went poorly for it. And that's it! That's my monster design in its entirety, and what I submitted to Kobold Press for their approval. So, how did this actually translate into publication? Well, quite well actually. First off, let's just take a look at the artist's rendition of this monster. Boom. Look at that thing! Isn't that just horrifying? Sure, it did come out looking a lot more like a centipede than that of the old rotted tree look that I was hoping for, but I honestly kind of expected that to happen, so that's totally fine. Besides, the thing that I just absolutely love is the fact they went that extra mile and included the severed wyvern tail from the little description blurb that I left at the top of the page. So that's just immense bonus points for me, just how awesome that looks. Anyway, taking a look down through the lore that I gave them, they really didn't change anything about it, with the exception of just some grammatical fixes here and there. However, there is one sentence that they did add to it, and I'll read it off here. The mold secretes an acid that evaporates harmlessly shortly after being exposed to the air. That is such a nice detail to add in there, as it really just completely explains how the mold in the Kirakari shell actually works to produce its mist. Honestly, I was very close to the word count limit on this submission, so it's just great that they were willing to add that on their own fruition. Anyway, I absolutely just love that they gave it that little bit of detail. Moving on down towards its stats, they didn't really change a whole lot to its core stats, only dropping its strength by 1 to lower its attack bonus. However, that doesn't really matter all that much in the end, and we'll get to that later. Anyway, they didn't change its AC, but they did buff its HP by a pretty sizable amount, by like 40 points. They probably did this because the damage immunities that it had weren't enough to actually warrant it having a lower hit point total, so in that regard I'm pretty okay with that. Otherwise, they did end up removing the 20 feet of blind sight from the creature, and having it only having a 60 feet of tremor sense. Honestly, the blind sense probably was a bit overkill, so I can completely understand why they did that. So yeah, not a whole lot of changes so far, but a lot of changes really did come in the creature's features. First off, they added a completely new feature called Corrosive Mold, which dealt damage to a creature grappled by the Kirakari's bite attack. Honestly, I really like this idea, as it gives the creature a better incentive to bite a creature and then not have to dedicate all of its slam attacks to then deal more damage to it. So yeah, again, another great idea. As for its Misty Veil, it works exactly the same, but they just cut its range from 60 feet to 30. Honestly, it's still a huge area, so I'm not entirely upset by that at all. Finally, Unseen Attacker got a complete overhaul, now being a feature that simply increases the damage dealt by the Kirakari when it attacks a creature unaware of its presence. Honestly, I'm fine with this. The original concept was far more clunky, and probably less likely to be useful for the Dungeon Master during combat. So now this is very practical and just simply adds additional damage. And that's always fun, honestly. Oh, speaking of more damage, all of its attack actions basically were left unchanged, but they just made them deal more damage. The slam attack got an additional bonus of acid damage to it, and the acid damage on the bite attack was then changed to poison. Honestly, I'm completely fine with this, because none of this added damage actually really changes the Kirakari's lethality. All it really does is increase the average damage that it can cause overall, which is great for it being an ambush predator. And thankfully, the blinding veil ability was left completely unchanged, as I was really happy with how that ability functioned for the creature in general. So yeah, that's everything. All things considered, I'm really happy with how my monster turned out. And a lot of the changes and adjustments that they actually did make to it just really helped tighten up the loose bits of its design and made it work really well for its intended role. Thanks again to Kobold Press for accepting my monster into your book, and cheers towards all of your future projects. I hope that they turn out just as awesome as this one did. And that's it. If you liked the video, then be sure to subscribe and let me know what you think down in the comments below. And if you'd like to have the chance to play D&D with me, then feel free to join my Discord server, and consider supporting me over on Patreon. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see all of you in the next video.